Migrant infrastructure pushed to the max, a state of emergency in effect now in New York City. We're going to break down what that means and how the situation will develop. Hi everybody and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. New York City is under that state of emergency over the tens of thousands of migrants being sent up here from southern border states. City Mayor Eric Adams explaining that as of this weekend, 18,000 asylum seekers have arrived in New York City, putting the city's shelters to near full capacity. To help relieve the pressure, a Times Square area hotel will now serve some 200 migrant families. That hotel joins several other hotels also serving as emergency shelters. All right, we're joined now by Sienna Freeman, an Albany lawyer with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna. Sienna, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about what's happening in New York City. We're seeing busloads of these migrants, tens of thousands coming into the city from these southern border states, mainly from Texas. Seemingly, they don't know where they're going. They're getting put on a bus and brought up here. And I know the city has talked about taking possible legal action. Do they have a course of legal action here?
At this time, we're not so sure about whether or not there is a course of legal action because we have to investigate about whether or not they are voluntarily getting on those buses. I think that's where the legal criminality comes into play. What happens is once someone comes into the U.S. and they're processed through the federal system, they are just like in the criminal system. They are, let out on bond or on their own recognizance, and so they leave the federal system and now they're just in the state. Now, unless the immigration ICE enforcement officers request that they remain in the state, those individuals, the migrants, are free to go anywhere in the U.S. as long as they inform the court of their address. So at that point, it becomes a state issue. And what we're not sure is what is compelling the migrants to get on the bus and go to New York or get on the bus and go to Massachusetts, so on and so forth.
Right, and the human rights issue here, of course, is an entirely other discussion. But I think from
Exactly.
what we've seen here, especially in the case of the ones that got brought up to Martha's Vineyard there in Massachusetts, is that seemingly they were handed some sort of pamphlet or literature that promised all sorts of stuff that maybe made them get on that airplane, and then once they landed, they realized that none of that was available to them.
Exactly. So that's when it becomes an issue for local governments, such as the San Antonio Sheriff's Department. I think they were doing an investigation into this issue on whether this was involuntary, whether it was coerced, and that's when the criminality comes into play at that time, and that's when the local sheriff's office, under individuals with jurisdiction over those areas where this happened, where this transaction happened, for them to go from one state to another. When they got on that bus, that's where they have to investigate and see if there's any legal causes of action.
And once all these people are getting off those buses in New York City, most of them with some paperwork and really just the clothes on their back, if they haven't really been instructed, they're not even really sure what to do once they get there. And what help and what kind of resources legally should be made available to them?
Well, that's the first issue that we have is when they get off their buses, first thing we have to do is check and see whether or not where their court hearing is going to be, whether they need to report to any ICE officers, where they're required to report to ICE officers back in Texas. We want to make sure they're not in violation of anything involving their federal proceedings, their immigration court proceedings. But once we get that taken care of as their legal advocates, then we figure out how can we get them permission to work in the U.S. And if they have a file for asylum, which people are allowed to do, then they can be eligible to work in the U.S. After 150 days, they can apply. So the problem is during that 150 days, they may not have any resources. And so that's when, we have all these great nonprofits on the ground who place them in housing, help them find food and resources, things such as that. Another thing you must know is that they are eligible if they applied for asylum to get some assistance from the state in terms of food and housing.
And what is that process for a lot of people that aren't familiar with applying for asylum? What does it mean and how does it work?
Basically, anyone from any other country is allowed to apply for asylum here in the U.S. They come to the border. They say they are fearing they have a fear of returning to their home country. And basically what you're saying is you don't believe that your government will protect you, in essence, and you will be persecuted. And so they apply for asylum. most of the migrants at the border, they go through the credible fear interview process. Basically, an asylum officer does a quick interview with them to see if they even have a credible fear of returning to their home country. And at that point, if they're found to have a credible fear, then they're allowed to continue into the country and apply for asylum in front of the immigration court.
And I think at this point, it even remains in a lot of these cases, if remains to be seen if that's even being done before they're being shipped up north.
Exactly. We know in the legal community, in the immigration law community, that a lot of asylum officers have been focusing on the credible fear interview at the border. We know they've been doing a lot of those credible fears because we've been getting backlogged here in the New Jersey, New York area on our normal asylum cases because all those asylum officers are working on those credible fear interviews now. We know the federal government has increased those, but we are concerned about whether or not they are being placed on these buses before they go through their complete process.
Right.
Or their federal government, their federal immigration court process is not complete or where it needs to be before they're being bused somewhere else. And so that's our primary concern because we don't want them to end up with a deportation order, removal order, because they failed to appear for a hearing.
From where you sit in your position, do you think this is a process that needs to be revisited and possibly streamlined if we're going to handle mass cases of people coming into our states like this?
Oh, yes, we do. We saw some really good programs coming in for the Ukrainians, and that's what the Biden administration right now is trying to replicate for the individuals from Venezuela. So right now they are encouraging individuals, if you have a sponsor here in the US, a financial sponsor in the US, they're saying that you can fly in, you can apply for parole, and they will allow you in, you'll get work authorization. And once you're in the US, you have 2 years to figure, well, you're supposed to file asylum within 1 year, but you'll have work authorization for 2 years. And that's a great program that worked for the Ukrainians, and we're hoping it's going to help with the Venezuelans. And that way it will kind of help some of that pressure at the border. And so we can get other countries coming in as well through that process of credible fear asylum.
Do you know of anybody or any colleagues that are on the ground there in New York City at the moment, kind of helping out here and dealing with this, and what are their thoughts?
Well, not even in New York, even closer. Here in Albany, some of the organizations that I work with have been discussing how we've been receiving buses from New York City here in the Albany area as well, because there's so much, they're so overworked down in New York City that now they're moving up to Albany. And Albany does have a very rich refugee community. And so we have a lot of nonprofit organizations that assist in placing the refugees traditionally, and now they're assisting in replacing the migrants as they come up.
All right, Sienna Freeman, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan.
And we also caught up with the executive director of the New York Immigrant Coalition on that state of emergency declaration and how it will provide for comprehensive coordination with the federal government.
We've been calling for federal, state, and local coordination since the first bus arrived in New York City. It is critically important to ensure that every level of government is stepping up in this moment so that New York as a state and New York City as a city that has welcomed folks for centuries can continue to do that, but with the supports that we need to ensure that everyone who's coming in has what they need to get on their own feet. And we know that this is an unprecedented moment for the city's shelter system. But what we also know is that the city has had a housing crisis for over 20 years. And that has produced an enormous amount of folks who are unhoused across the city. So what we need to be doing is, yes, ensure that everyone gets a bed in emergency shelter, but we also need to be dealing with creating affordable, long-term, permanent housing for people who are in the shelter system.
Well, as winter rolls in, the threat of a bad flu season meets the gradual increase in some COVID-19 cases. When we return, a public health expert on the steps you can take to keep yourself and your family safer and healthier this winter. And remember, got a comment, story idea you'd like to share with us? Let us know. Email us at empirestateweekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly here in Albany. I'm Ryan Peterson. The FDA is approving new upgraded COVID-19 booster shots for kids as young as 5 years old. Pfizer getting the green light for use on kids 5 to 11. Moderna approved for kids as young as 6. The approval comes a few months after bivalent boosters got approval to combat COVID and its contagious variants this winter. These steps come as some health experts anticipate a harsh, severe flu season, as well as with high case numbers reported in Australia. All right, we're joined now by Johannes Chemueno, the Chief Executive Officer with VIP Star Health Services. Johannes, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ryan. It's a pleasure being here.
So first, for those who may not be familiar with you and the company, can you explain to us what exactly it is that you guys do?
Yeah, we're a mobile healthcare comprehensive company, so we focus on multiple areas of concentration in terms of access to medical care for a variety of different populations of patients across the state of New York, as well as many other states across the country.
Fantastic. So we're heading into this flu season now, and as we've just reported and we've been talking about for quite some time, health experts expecting a robust season. After what we've seen happen in Australia, they think that flu season could be pretty severe. What do you want people to know, and how important is it to vaccinate yourself against the flu, particularly this season?
Well, I mean, if we take a step back and we look back pre-pandemic, we saw that influenza was a leading cause of death across the United States. Prior to the pandemic, the number of infections and cases was definitely high, and we saw the trends consistently change from year to year. But when the pandemic happened, as a look back, we saw that social distancing, mask wearing, people taking their health more seriously, saw a decline in infections in terms of influenza. So now we have to look at that data and say, okay, what did we do right? What can we change based on our everyday living and our activities of daily living, rather? And so from the data that we see out of Australia and many other countries across Europe, they're taking the influenza season extremely serious, Ryan, to say the least. And so your question of asking what can we do, I think is an important question.
And not just get the shot, but also perhaps consider, and we've seen a lot of the COVID restrictions get loosened or eliminated outright in a lot of communities around the U.S. now, maybe consider wearing a mask again during the next few months and practicing that social distancing, right? Can all enhance our chances of staying healthy.
Well, absolutely. I mean, here in the city, we see the subways are starting to get more crowded. Across larger mass gatherings. People are going back to the Yankee games, which we have a game coming up shortly as well here in the city. And so you look at those mass gatherings, you look at higher populated and more dense areas, and you know that you're going to be closer in proximity to not just one person, but multiple people in one setting. And so, yes, having a mask handily available definitely doesn't hurt. Exercising caution across areas that you can potentially social distance is also important, but also most importantly, taking those levels of protection, getting in line at one of our locations, or even some of the local pharmacies for a flu shot is definitely important, as well as most importantly, COVID-19 is still out there and still increasing hospitalizations as well as infections. And so it's important that we take every option as possible in terms of precautions.
And certainly cases and hospitalizations have dropped dramatically, but they're expected to rise again a little bit as we head into the winter, but certainly not as bad as we saw last winter. So there is that now bivalent shot out there, the upgraded booster for the Omicron variant. What should people know about that? And one of the biggest questions we often hear around these parts is it safe to get both the flu shot and that booster at the same time, or should you space them out?
No, I think it's extremely important. That's what we're doing now at our mobile sites, Ryan. We are taking every option that we can to put use one arm for a intramuscular injection for COVID-19. Most importantly, to your point, Ryan, the bivalent booster has now been approved, and the CDC and the FDA have taken so many different precautions, as well as new measurements to ensure the efficacy and a high level of strength is available for these patients, specific to the bivalent booster. But most importantly, the flu shot can be taken simultaneously at the same time that you receive your COVID-19 shot. And that's based on our experts on our team, as well as the myriad of healthcare professionals that we have at our locations.
How soon should the flu shot be administered? I've heard differing opinions here. Some people say you should perhaps get it by Halloween because it takes a little while for that to build up in your system.
That's right. I mean, our healthcare experts are saying that same statement to our patients. I mean, when they have the chance to educate patients, it doesn't hurt taking the shot anytime now through the end of the month. But again, the season goes longer than expected. And so as here across the northeastern seaboard, this winter month can be extremely challenging for many people to just even get out of their home because of the various strong forms of the weather conditions out there. And so looking at the flu shot as soon as possible. I will tell you, and I think it's important to note, that the supply chain is still a constraint across the manufacturers and distributors of flu vaccines. And so early on through last winter months, people had to put their pre-order in to have shots available. And so these organizations, corporations rather, are on a delay on shipping out vaccines. And so if you have the chance to receive a flu shot, definitely take it seriously.
And there is a difference too between shots for say those of adult age and those in the senior category. Is that correct? For those 65 and up, that flu shot tends to be a little bit stronger, gives them a little bit more protection?
Well, absolutely. I mean, again, looking back pre-pandemic to where we are now, the senior populations had a higher likelihood of hospitalizations and infections related to COVID-19. It's the same thing for the flu shots. Those kind of run in parallel. And so looking at that older population of patients, as well as the congregate settings that they're typically housed in, is extremely important for those age groups as well as the demographics to take the shot. And remember, if we look back at the demographic data for African American, Hispanic, Latino origins, the likelihood of those infections taking a stronger toll in terms of hospitalizations and deaths was higher throughout the pandemic than it was previous years. And so looking at that as an important step is extremely important for these patients to take the opportunity to receive their flu shot as well as COVID-19 shot.
And as people are looking to make these appointments to get either the flu shot or the booster shot for Omicron, your company has supplied some locations. Where can people find more information if there's a location near them?
Yeah, they can go to our website at vipstarnetwork.com. They can go to our patient registration system, which is at registration.impass.com, which allows for people to locate various locations across the state, as well as the 5 boroughs here in the city. And so we've got our location there and a very easy online system to register for their appointment.
All right, Johannes Chemweno, CEO of VIP Star Network Health Services. We appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Okay, take care.
You got it. President Biden is erasing simple marijuana possession convictions for thousands of Americans. We're going to break down the impact, how this will work, we'll have for New York and the nation. And remember, if you've got a comment, story idea, let us know. You can email us at empirestateweekly@gmail.com or seek us out on Twitter. All right, welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. President Biden recently announced he is pardoning all prior federal offenses of simple possession of marijuana. He says thousands of people may have been denied employment, housing, education because of their conviction. Correspondent Jamie DeLine tells us what this means for New Yorkers.
President Joe Biden has announced 3 steps when it comes to marijuana reform here in the United States.
No one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana.
He says black and brown people have been arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at disproportionate rates. The president now directing the U.S. Attorney General to develop an administrative process to issue pardon certificates to those eligible. Lauren Rudick, partner of the cannabis law practice at Hiller PC, explains who qualifies.
So a very discrete set of former prisoners are the ones who are going to be impacted by this. We're talking about 6,000 or 6,500 people who are federal offenders.
The pardon is only for the offense of simple marijuana possession.
Simple marijuana possession is basically you had it in your pocket. There was no intent to distribute it. That's very important to note as well. This is strictly somebody has X amount of marijuana in their possession and they're charged under a federal crime.
The president also calling on governors to have a similar pardon for state marijuana offenses.
You know, federal prisoners actually do not make up the bulk of prisoners associated with cannabis arrests. Most of those arrests are happening at the state level.
New York State's Office of Cannabis Management thanks the president's announcement as a step in the right direction, saying in part, quote, "Here in New York, we've already cleared the record of more than 400,000 cannabis arrest records, and we're prioritizing those impacted the most for participation in the equitable industry we're working at building." And lastly, Biden is asking the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Attorney General, to review how marijuana is scheduled under federal law.
It's currently classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug, along with heroin and LSD. This isn't something where individuals are overdosing on it on a regular basis compared to some of the other Schedule I drugs. So I think really what you're beginning to see with the Biden administration is how can we make this equitable for everybody who has a previous conviction?
In Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
Thanks to Jamie. All right, stick around. We'll be right back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. And remember, if you've got a comment or a story idea you'd like us to look into, let us know. You can always email us, empirestateweekly@gmail.com, or seek us out on Twitter. And finally, here on Empire State Weekly, a federal appeals court is going to allow New York to continue enforcing its new gun law. This reprieve comes after a federal judge declared a hold on the law, calling it parts of it unconstitutional, said it went too far. Next week, we'll continue to follow developing legal issues as the state appeals that decision. We will, of course, follow the updates, so stay with us. From all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. I'll see you back here next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over the state of New York. Here's a full schedule of where you can find us on 10 television stations across the state.